we have a lot of people that are dying of bizarre respiratory conditions all the time. There seems to be a syndrome that is familiar with COVID, and that syndrome harkens back to another coronavirus of 2001, 2002 with SARS. And the description of SARS is so incredible in the literature. When you read the initial scientific studies coming out of 2002, 2003 around SARS, it literally says the patients turn blue and then have to wait until their lungs eventually fill with fluid and then they die. The course of events there is very important. They first turn blue before their lungs have fluid in them. And so there's not a respiratory failure that leads this thing. And then eventually with the fluid in their lungs, they develop pneumonia and die. This is exactly what's happening with this COVID strain. So another coronavirus presenting with hypoxia, which is a loss of oxygen in tissue. So the patients are presenting blue and with these remarkably low numbers of oxygen in the bloodstream. And yet a lot of them look pretty comfortable. They're not breathing fast. They're not in any distress. And so the doctors are freaking out, trying to figure out, why is this patient sitting here talking to me with an oxygen level this low, blue in the face, and going into multi-organ failure? Liver is the number one thing when they screened. There was a nice article that showed what is the initial laboratories of 5,000 patients presenting with COVID-like symptoms in New York. Of those 5,000 patients, the vast majority didn't even have fever. The average temperature was 37 degrees Celsius, which is normal body temperature. And so they don't have fever, they don't have any signs of respiratory distress, and yet they have bump in liver enzymes. That's the only laboratory finding that seems to be consistent. Their white blood cells aren't elevated as if they have a virus. They don't have shift in triglycerides, suggesting some inflammatory event. And so there's nothing in that article I'm pouring through and like, show me the evidence that this person is having a viral infection. Show me the evidence that there's some signs in the immune system or otherwise that there's a virus at foot. Instead, they're dying of hypoxia. They have loss of oxygen at the tissue level, and their tissue is being starved of oxygen. And it turns out when you have a hypoxic injury, loss of oxygen in the lung, you get something called ground glass reaction. You get fluid that starts to accumulate in the lung because of that hypoxic injury, a lack of oxygen. In the vascular system, you start to get dysfunction of the endothelium, where you can no longer make vasodilatory effects, and you start to lose the mechanics of venous supply and venous drainage and all of this, and that leads to stasis, which you can get blood clots from stasis and all this. And so the whole body, from liver to bloodstream to your other organs, are showing signs, including the lungs, of a loss of oxygen. This looks as if you suddenly put this person on the top of Mount Everest and took them from sea level to Mount Everest in 5 minutes, and that's what the patient suddenly looks like. So that happened in 2002, and it's happening again. So what is going on there? If there's no signs of a viral infection, what is going on, and why are we finding COVID in some of these bloodstreams? And so what seems to be happening, whether we're looking at SARS, MERS, or this, is a constellation of events that are happening in the bloodstream to induce a high altitude-like injury or hypoxic injury to the whole system. And then eventually, if we don't fix that problem, they're going to fill their lungs with fluid because we didn't reverse the hypoxic thing. And if you put them on a respiratory machine, you actually just made the situation worse, because forced oxygen is very noxious. High pressure oxygen is very noxious to the tissue of the lungs. If you push oxygen in and the bloodstream still can't bind it, you haven't fixed the hypoxemic event. And so you're pushing an oxidative injury, which is inflammatory, onto a tissue that can't absorb the oxygen at the tissue level. And so we know we're seeing extraordinary rates of death. 88% of people on a respirator in New York are dying. Nowhere else in the world did we see levels that high of mortality. And so we are part of the problem when we keep thinking that we have a respiratory failure event. SARS to now, that's 18 years of science, has shown us that this is a hypoxic injury, not a viral infection type thing. So if it was a virus that was overwhelming your system, you would see your immune system respond appropriately. Fever can happen downstream in COVID, but it's not at the beginning of this infectious process. It's actually in week 2 that you tend to see the fevers spike up and all that. Again, 5,000 people presenting in New York, their body temperature as a population is stone cold normal at presentation. It's not until days later, when their fluids have filled with lungs in a hospital environment and now they have secondary bacterial infection, that they get the fevers. And so there's downstream signs of overwhelm to the system, hypoxic injury, and an accumulation of infectious-like symptoms, but that's not the presentation. And so as soon as we come to terms with this as a medical community, I think we're going to save lives really rapidly. We need to treat this like a hypoxic injury. And we have a lot of interesting data out of there. And I'm making a film right now on what I think is going on. So, and what I think is probably very incomplete because my clinic's not allowed to be open right now, which is so ironic. If you think you have a hospital overload capacity, then don't close all the clinics. Like, don't say that all the clinics out there that aren't associated with a hospital are suddenly non-essential. If you don't want an overloaded hospital system, keep the clinics open, but that's an aside. And so I haven't been able to treat those patients with this, but I offer it to any physician to start to explore this. Is we need to treat this as a hypoxic injury similar to cyanide poisoning. And so we need to start to put in the pieces to change the shape of the hemoglobin, which we can do. We know how to treat cyanide poisoning. Cyanide poisoning happens to present exactly like COVID syndrome, which is non-febrile, blue patient, with signs of liver failure and hypoxemic injury to the organs, developing later into respiratory death. And so we have a very well established treatment plan for cyanide poisoning, and it's 3 quick injections of a cyanide kit, and you're using things like sodium nitrate in there to change the shape of hemoglobin so that it can bind through methemoglobin the oxygen again. And so we have an FDA-approved mechanism of treating cyanide. We should turn that kind of mindset to that. Now, am I right? Is that going to fix the problem? It may be more complicated than that, but until we start treating the hemoglobin as an initial injury, we're never going to solve the downstream infections that are happening, because people aren't dying of COVID again. They're dying of secondary pneumonias that are bacterial in nature downstream, and some of them are dying of a hypoxic organ failure, but they're not dying of a virus per se. You don't see any of the signs in those 5,000 patients.
All right, but the virus is causing that problem, right? I mean, in some ways, isn't it semantics to say that, well, the virus isn't causing a fever like the way a virus would, but it is, in fact, causing this hemoglobin problem, this inability to carry oxygen correctly, something that was pointed out by the MD in New York, Kyle Seidel, who came forward and said, this seems like my patients are at 30,000 feet. So on one hand, you would say, oh, it's not a virus, people shouldn't be afraid, but there are people that this virus is causing this hypoxic issue, is it not?
It's participating in it for sure. I think it's very, I mean, we haven't proven that yet, but I think there's a distinct possibility that the virus is participating in the unmasking of this hemoglobin shift. And when I say unmasking, it can't be causing it directly, else everybody who got exposed to the virus would be having a hypoxic injury. But very few people who get exposed to the virus and mount an antibody response and all of the typical things you would expect actually presented with blue organ failure. Very few percent. And so the protein, there's a new protein, we're told, and we'll figure, this needs to be proven out still, but we're told there's a new RNA strand, a new, that codes for a new protein that is different than SARS and MERS. Okay, great. But something in SARS and MERS did the same thing. And so there's been something stable in these coronaviruses that is unmasking in a small percentage of patients this hemoglobin type effect. So then should we say, well, it's the virus causing it? Well, if it was the virus causing it, again, everybody who was exposed would have that. So what is the virus doing? The virus seems to be unmasking toxicity of our environment. And so in that air pollution, we know it carries many things, including cyanide. And so cyanide, we know, is a part of normal air pollution. In fact, a really nice, Earth Justice paper got released just months before this whole pandemic, story unfolded. There was a Earth Justice mandate for kind of a class action lawsuit demand on the EPA for not accounting and not doing anything about the rising levels of cyanide in many of the U.S. cities. And we were above, safe thresholds of cyanide over and over again, and there was nothing being done. And so Earth Justice recognized that, and then months later, we see people dying of something that looks like cyanide poisoning. And so that what I think is interesting is the possibility that nature, in a toxic stew of dying soils in a glyphosate Roundup intense farming area of China, has unmasked the relationship of cyanide to hemoglobin. And is this an adaptive event happening as nature has exuded this?